A Program for the Jews and an Answer to All Anti-Semites, by Waton. Since 1914, great historic events have taken place. There was the World War, the Russian Revolution, and the upheavals in Europe and elsewhere. These historic events brought to mankind disillusionment and bitter disappointment. The World War, which was expected to end all wars, only prepared the ground for still more frightful wars. The Russian Revolution, which was expected to bring to the working masses freedom, emancipation, and communism, only brought them an oppressive dictatorship, a more intense exploitation and state capitalism. And the upheavals in Europe and elsewhere, which were conceived in democracy, internationalism, and socialism, only brought fascism, an insane nationalism and Hitlerism. And whatever these events brought to other nations, to the Jews they brought only greater misery, suffering, and despair. Anti-Semitism, which before 1914 found open outbursts among backward nations and in semi-civilized countries, since then has become the social philosophy and economic political policy of the most cultured people in the most civilized countries. Modern Balaams came to the fore and, in the name of culture, religion, science, art, and philosophy, endeavored to prove that the Jews and Judaism are inherently wicked and evil, and a deadly menace to the Western nations, their culture and their civilization, and that, to save the Western nations, their culture and civilization from decline and extinction, it is necessary to exterminate the Jews and Judaism. Hence the slogan, "Death to the Jews and Judaism." Following up the world events, reflecting on the new philosophies that came to the fore, I convinced myself that human society is irresistibly and inevitably moving towards state capitalism and fascism. Further reflection also convinced me that this social transformation would inevitably bring upon the Jews great suffering. How could the Jews face this world situation? This question occupied my mind for the last 12 years, and these, to me, years of intellectual and spiritual agony. At last I reached the conclusion which I embodied in a program for the Jews. Since then I often spoke on this program. When the Jews declared war against Nazi Germany and fascism, I saw that that was a suicidal policy, which would bring to the Jews infinite suffering. I spoke against that policy, but no attention was paid to it. Thus passed more than 5 years of ever-increasing suffering for the Jews. When the situation became so grave that the Jews themselves began to realize the gravity of the situation, the members of the Spinoza Institute of America asked me to formulate my program. In an address delivered by me before the members of the Spinoza Institute on October 23, 1938, I presented to them, in brief, my program. As a result of this address, a committee organized itself under the name, the Committee for the Preservation of the Jews, and this committee published my address under the title, A Program for the Jews. 10,000 copies of that program are published and distributed. Thus far, this program met with universal condemnation. This I expected, but I soon realized that, if my program is to receive a more friendly hearing, it must be presented adequately. The following is a more adequate basis for my program. Dated, Bell Harbor, New York, March 28, 1939. Waton. A Program for the Jews. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And no one can stay his hand or say unto him, What dost thou? Daniel 4, 31-32. 1. When in 1929 our inflated prosperity burst like a soap bubble and revealed the unsoundness of our economic system, its inherent contradictions and its decay, it was universally believed that this was only a local and temporary economic disturbance, which would soon pass away and prosperity would come to us again. Since then, more than 9 years passed. During these years, more than $100 billion worth of actual and potential values disappeared. Tens of millions of human beings in this country suffered privation, misery, and humiliation, and the government sank ever deeper into a morass of deficits. Notwithstanding all this, we still believe that the economic crisis is only of a temporary nature, which will soon pass away, and we still confidently hope for the return of prosperity in the near future. During these years, the government, the brain trusts, and the leaders in industry, commerce, and finance were searching for the philosopher's stone by which they hoped to regenerate our economic system to revive business and to restore to us prosperity, but all in vain. The philosopher's stone was not discovered, the economic system was not regenerated, business was not revived, and prosperity did not come. All New Deal measures taken by the government proved futile, and futile they had to be. For they sought to meet what seemed to be only a local and temporary disturbance, whereas what faced us was a universal and permanent situation. If from the beginning of the crisis the government, the brain trusts, and the leaders in industry, commerce, and finance had realized that we were confronted with a universal and permanent situation, and had adopted a radical measure to meet that situation, we would have been spared infinite suffering, and now we would have been in a far better position, and the future would be bright. But we did not adopt such radical measure, because we did not understand the nature of the situation that confronted us. To adopt a radical measure implies a recognition of the fact that a revolutionary transformation of society is taking place all over the world, and this would require a change of ideas, a change of philosophy, and a change of the mode of life. But men will rather perish than change their ideas, their philosophy, and their mode of life. This was the universal tragedy of mankind, this is their present tragedy, and this is also the tragedy of the Jews. 2. When Hitler came to power and began to realize and practice his anti-Semitic philosophy, the Jews believed that this was only a local and temporary political disturbance, which would soon pass away, and the Jews in Germany would again enjoy peace and security. The Jews declared war against Nazi Germany, and by means of the boycott they believed that they would destroy the Nazi power in Germany and would restore Germany to its former state. More than 6 years passed since then. During these years the Jews in Germany and Austria were expropriated of their property, their possessions and their interests, they were deprived of their political and legal rights, they were humiliated and degraded, and they were subjected to infinite misery, suffering, and torture. Tens of thousands of Jews in Germany and Austria were tortured in the prisons and the concentration camps, thousands of them were brutally murdered, and hundreds of them were driven to commit suicide. And outside of Germany and Austria, the position of the Jews became ever worse. Millions of Jews are now in distress and are threatened with expulsion from the countries in which they live, and this at a time when all other countries are entirely closed against them. The position of the Jews in the world is now infinitely worse than it was 6 years ago. Notwithstanding all this, the Jews still believe that this is only a local and temporary political disturbance, which will soon pass away. All measures taken by the Jews to meet this seemingly local and temporary political disturbance proved futile, and futile they had to be, for these measures could not meet a situation that was universal and permanent. If from the beginning, when Hitler rose to power, the Jews had realized that they were confronted with a very serious universal and permanent situation, and they had adopted a radical program to meet the situation, they would have spared themselves infinite misery and suffering. Their present position in the world would have been far better, and their future would not be so desperate. But the Jews did not adopt a radical program because they did not understand the situation that confronted them. To adopt a radical program would imply the recognition that a revolutionary transformation of society is taking place all over the world, and this would require a change of ideas, a change of philosophy, and a change of the mode of life. But, like the rest of mankind, the Jews will rather perish than change their ideas, their philosophy, and their mode of life. This was the tragedy of the Jews in the past, and this is also their tragedy now. 3. During all these years I was waiting and hoping that some leader among the Jews would come to the fore with a radical program which could meet the universal and permanent situation that confronts the Jews, but in vain no such leader came to the fore with such program. Reflecting on the Jewish question and the world situation that confronts the Jews, I crystallized a definite idea of a radical program for the Jews to meet the world situation, but I hesitated to come to the fore with this program for the following reasons. First, I am not a leader among the Jews, and I would at once be met with the old question: who made thee a leader among the Jews? Secondly, because my program is a radical program, requiring a change of ideas, of philosophy, and of the mode of life, the Jews would not accept it. At last I was challenged to come out with my program. I regarded this challenge as a hint from destiny. The ancient rabbis said, "There where there are no men endeavor to be a man." Since no Jewish leader comes to the fore with a radical program to meet the world situation, since I have crystallized an idea of such program, and since I was challenged to come out with my program, I decided to brush aside all considerations and present my program. I know that my program will not be accepted, and I also know that I will be condemned for this program. I will be condemned not only by the Jews but also by the Christians, by the communists, by the fascists, by the liberals, by the conservatives, by the reactionaries, and also by the anti-Semites. In a word, I will be universally condemned. I will be universally condemned because my program is radical, revolutionary, and universal. It is a program not only for the Jews, but for the whole human race. The Jews are not the only ones involved in this world situation, but the whole human race is involved in it. The Jewish question is really a question of the whole human race. And since my program is radical, revolutionary, and
Universal.
it will strike a fatal blow at shared ideas, accepted philosophies, and established modes of life. Hence, in presenting my program, I face universal opposition and universal condemnation. But I am not perturbed by this, and I entertain no ill feelings against anyone. I am doing my duty, and in this I am armed with the convictions. First, that my program should be accepted by non-Jews as well as Jews. Secondly, though my program will be universally rejected, it will realize itself just the same.
Fata volentem ducunt, nolentem traunt.
If my program be accepted, mankind will avoid infinite misery and suffering. If it will not be accepted, my program will realize itself just the same, but only after mankind will have suffered infinitely. Since I face universal opposition and universal condemnation, I feel perfectly free to say what I deem it my duty to say, leaving to destiny to determine the consequences. Again, since I do not expect that my program will be accepted, and yet I am convinced that it will be realized, my program will be in the nature of a prophecy, and I will necessarily suffer the fate of the prophet. Prudence would warn me to refrain from prophesying, but I disregard prudence and do my duty. 4. A program to meet a universal and permanent situation must necessarily rest upon a universal philosophy. To understand my program, it is necessary to know and understand my philosophy. But within the scope of a program, a universal philosophy cannot be adequately presented. All that I can do is to present as much of my philosophy as is absolutely essential to an understanding of my program. This is not to be regretted. Philosophy does not determine life, rather life determines philosophy. We do not live according to philosophy, but philosophize according to the dictates of life. All that philosophy can accomplish is to reveal to us the requirements of life. And, if we are wise, we shall then profit by the wisdom of philosophy. My program concerns the whole human race, yet I address myself principally to the Jews, for the following reasons. First, my program concerns the Jews more directly and immediately than it concerns the rest of mankind, and therefore the Jews should be the first to adopt it. Secondly, the Jews are preeminently qualified to realize a program to meet a universal and permanent situation. This, indeed, is their historic function. As in the past, so now the Jews must be the pioneers of a new philosophy of life. 5. What is the universal and permanent situation that confronts the Jews and the rest of mankind? It is the rise and spread of fascism. I use the term fascism as comprehending Nazism and communism. For, as we shall see later, they are all the same. They all mean a new social order and a new philosophy of life. Fascism is regarded by the anti-fascists as a world menace, an evil that threatens to destroy society, religion, civilization, progress, liberty, democracy, and humanity. Now, whatever be the nature of an evil, to overcome it or to render it harmless, it is first necessary to understand the nature of the evil and the cause of it. If we are to overcome fascism or to render it harmless, we must first understand its nature and the cause of it. Fascism did not fall from the sky, nor was it created by Mussolini, Stalin, or Hitler. Fascism grew out of certain historic and economic conditions, and it has a definite historic function to perform. Assuming that fascism is what the Jews and the anti-fascists think it is, the first thing that is incumbent upon the Jews and the anti-fascists is to understand Thenatory and Thecosophiscism. Now, the Jews and anti-fascists believe that they understand the nature and the cause of fascism. But, as we shall presently see, they have not the remotest idea of fascism and its cause. The very fact that the Jews and the anti-fascists believe that fascism is only a local and temporary phenomenon, and that they can destroy fascism, This alone proves that neither the Jews nor the anti-fascists understand the nature of fascism and its historic function. We shall presently see that fascism is a historic phase of social evolution through which mankind must pass, and nothing in creation can prevent this. 6. What do the Jews know about fascism? They know fascism only from their own viewpoint, only insofar as fascism affects them. And, since fascism affects them most painfully, the Jews regard fascism as a world menace. But do the Jews know fascism from the viewpoint of the fascists? To know and understand fascism from the viewpoint of the fascists, the Jews must place themselves in the position of the fascists, and from their viewpoint see fascism. The Jews must place themselves in the position of the fascists and from their viewpoint consider the Jewish question and the present social order. Have the Jews tried to understand fascism from the fascist viewpoint? Now, it is natural and easy to misunderstand an enemy and to hate him, but this does not help to overcome an enemy or render him harmless. To do this, we must transcend our emotional reactions against an enemy, and only then can we meet the enemy rationally and effectively. By barricading themselves against the understanding of fascism from the fascist viewpoint, the Jews only aggravate the situation that faces them. It is therefore of vital interest to the Jews themselves to make the supreme effort to transcend their emotional reactions against fascism and the fascists, and to endeavor to understand them. This they must do to serve their own interests. What is true of the Jews is equally true of the fascists. The fascists regard the Jews as a world menace. They are a menace to the Aryans, their culture, their morals, and their destiny. But what do the fascists know about Judaism and the Jews and their historic function? To know and understand Judaism, the Jews, and their historic function, it is necessary for the fascists to place themselves in the position of the Jews, to make a deep study of Judaism, and to perceive their historic function. But the fascists barricaded themselves against this understanding. The fascists flatter themselves with the illusion that, being for the moment apparently powerful, they will succeed to destroy the Jews and Judaism. Have the fascists ever read intelligently the history of the Jews? If they did read this history intelligently, they would see that far greater powers than the fascists have endeavored to destroy the Jews and Judaism, with the result that those mighty powers were destroyed and were forgotten, while the Jews still live and function on the historic stage, and Judaism is now as full of life as it was ever before. Are the fascists sure that they will not share the same fate as the enemies of the Jews shared all through history? Is it not in the interests of the fascists to make the supreme effort to transcend their emotional reactions against the Jews and Judaism, and endeavor to view them from the Jewish viewpoint? And now, suppose that the Jews and the fascists did achieve this, would they then understand the world situation that confronts the Humsan race? By no means, for they would still see the situation from two opposite viewpoints. They would not see the world situation from its historic aspect, for fascism is the work of history, and has a historic function to perform. Hence we must rise still higher and see the world situation in its historic aspect. But, alas, history is still a book sealed with 7 seals. 7. In the life and death struggle between the fascists and the Jews, and the great noise of them that shout with victory and of them that cry from defeat, one voice is not heard that, above all, should have been heard first, and that is the voice of history. Men plan, scheme, and plot to realize their petty aims and vain ambitions. In their ignorance, they believe that they can make history as they please. And when by destiny they are placed in a position of power, they imagine themselves to be supermen who, with impunity, can disregard reason, defy justice, and trample upon morality and humanity. But there is a logic of events, there is a moral order, there is a causal relation between conduct and consequence. And, above all, there is a historic destiny that overrides and overrules all plans, schemes, and plots of men. What Nebuchadnezzar, what Alexander, what Caesar, what Napoleon, what Stalin, what Mussolini, and what Hitler ever realized his aims and ambitions? Hegel said, "The study of history convinced him that men never learn from history. Men study history not for the purpose of finding out the nature, course, and destiny of history, so as to be able to conform with the requirements of history. But men study history to find out how they can cheat history, how they can evade the consequences of their evil deeds, how they can evade the fate that befell others like themselves. Men are like children. Children know that sickness, misfortune, and death are the common lot of men. Yet the children believe that they will never be sick, they will never suffer misfortune, and they will never die. In days of prosperity, men believe that they are the masters over history, but in days of adversity, they blame history. In neither case do they understand history. Worse still, they deny that there is history. And so it came to pass that until now history was only a record of frustrated aims and ruined ambitions. And this will continue so long as men entertain the illusion that they can make history as they please. 8. What is history? History is the process of human existence. It is the process that realizes the predetermined destiny of mankind. Mankind are destined to attain to reason, to become rational and morally autonomous, and live in peace and enjoy happiness. This predetermined destiny is an eternal idea of God. Man started out as an animal. He passed through the stages of savagery, barbarism, and reached the present state of civilization. But man will rise higher and higher until he will realize his predetermined destiny. Races, nations, and peoples came and passed away, but mankind continues to live, make progress, and rise ever higher towards its destiny. Did man plan this process? Did man conceive this destiny? It was God that planned the existence and the destiny of mankind. Can stupid man frustrate the plan of God? Can foolish man change the course of history? The fascists are determined to destroy the Jews and Judaism. Have the fascists consulted the plan of God to find out whether they can destroy the Jews and Judaism? Suppose the fascists consulted this plan of God. Suppose they convince themselves that it is the plan of God that the Jews and Judaism are the means through whom God brings to mankind salvation, light, and understanding. Will the fascists still want to destroy the Jews and Judaism? Will not the fascists then realize that it is in their interests to make peace with the Jews and Judaism? The fascists overestimate their power, and they underestimate the power of the Jews and Judaism. We shall see later that the Jews are far more numerous and infinitely more powerful than the fascists are. Not that the Jews fear the fascists, or have reasons to fear them, but the fascists fear the Jews and have good reason to fear them. And so, in presenting this program for the Jews, I do not face the fascists as one that has to convince them. Marx said, "Him whom we seek to convince, we recognize the master of the situation." I do not recognize the fascists as the masters of the situation. On the contrary, I recognize the Jews as the masters of the situation. But I speak to the fascists as well as to the Jews because it is not my purpose to overcome or to defeat the fascists. My purpose is to convince the fascists that it is in their own interests to cooperate with the Jews for the common good of mankind. There is no reason why, at this stage of human progress, we should blindly repeat the tragic experiences of the past. We can and we should learn from history. 9. I will present my program in 3 aspects. First, an economico-political aspect. Second, a biologico-cultural aspect. Third, a religio-historic aspect. The result will be an idea of a program. I say it will be an idea of a program for the following reason. A radical and revolutionary program to meet a universal and permanent world situation requires the cooperation of many experts, for there are numerous economic, political, cultural, and religious problems that must be solved. This task is beyond the power of any one man. My aim is only to present an idea for such a program. If the idea is accepted, then it will be the task of many others to work out the details of the program. I do my duty and leave to others to do their duty. The economico-political aspect. 10. What is fascism? The first thing we shall learn about fascism is the following. Fascism is the political form of state capitalism. It is the beginning of socialism. Marx tells us, in considering a social transformation, we must disregard the ideology of men. That is, we must disregard what men think or believe concerning this social transformation. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so we cannot judge a social transformation by its own consciousness. This means that, in endeavoring to understand the nature and historic function of fascism, we must disregard what the fascists and the anti-fascists think of fascism, or they think of one another, but we must endeavor to understand the historic significance of fascism. What does history accomplish by fascism? Fascism appears to the anti-fascists to be an evil, but this is due entirely to the fact that the anti-fascists do not understand fascism. Spinoza tells us that when we adequately understand an evil, it ceases to be an evil. It is the same with fascism. When we adequately understand fascism, it ceases to be an evil. We shall see later that the Jews have no reason to be opposed to fascism. 11. In his message to Congress, delivered January 4, 1939, President Roosevelt spoke of the imperative necessity to be prepared for the impending struggles between the fascist countries and the democratic countries. Among others, he said the following: "The deadline of danger from within and from without is not within our control. This is an admission that we are not the masters over history." Then President Roosevelt spoke of the need to change our policy so that we should be able to solve the problem of unemployed labor and unemployed capital, and said the following: "Dictatorships do this by main force. By using main force, they apparently succeeded at it for the moment. However we abhor their method, we are compelled to admit that they have obtained substantial utilization of all their material and human resources. Like it or not, they have solved, for a time at least, the problem of idle men and idle capital. Can we compete with them by boldly seeking methods of putting idle men and idle capital together and, at the same time, remain within our American way of life, within the Bill of Rights, and within the bounds of what is, from our viewpoint, civilization itself? Reflect on this. After 9 years of suffering and after we have experimented with various New Deal measures, we are compelled to compete with the fascist countries and their methods." President Roosevelt asked the question: can we solve the problem of unemployment of labor and capital in our American way? He did not answer the case tie-in, but history already answered this question, and the answer is, we shall be compelled to adopt fascist methods to meet the world situation that confronts us. A revolutionary transformation of society takes places all over the world. It is an economic, political, and social transformation. It is the passing away of the present social order and the coming of a new social order. The present social order rests on private capitalism, but private capitalism can no longer function. It can no longer meet the social requirements. It can no longer employ the working class and the accumulated capital, and therefore it no longer has any historic reason for existence. In this country alone, tens of millions of workers have been and still are out of employment and had to be sustained on state relief. Billions of dollars are hoarded and lie idle because there is no longer any room for their safe and profitable investment. Production is curtailed, products are destroyed, inventions are held back, and machines and factories are idle. Business is groaning under an ever-increasing burden of taxation. The government is piling up mountains of debts. And on the top of all this, the government is compelled to spend billions of dollars on war preparations. How long can such a system exist?
Mene, tekel, ufarsin, private.
Capitalism was weighed in the historic balance, it was found wanting, and it was decreed that it be retired from the stage of history. Private capitalism is dying, and in the near future it will be dead. It will either die peacefully and get an honorable burial, or it will die through wars and revolutions. With the death of private capitalism will also die all political and social institutions resting on private capitalism and organically bound up with it. And what is true of this country is even more so true of all other countries. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, so history abhors a hiatus. What system shall take the place of private capitalism? 12. If at this time the international proletariat were class-conscious, revolutionary, and organized, they would come to the fore, they would take in hand the land and the mechanism of production and distribution, they would use them in an organized, rational, and just manner, and thus they would establish socialism. Once socialism has been established, and all future social evolution would be towards a human society resting on universal communism. Only then will all social problems be solved. But the working class is not yet prepared to perform this historic function. We have then this situation. Private capitalism can no longer function, and socialism is yet impossible. What course is open for history? There is only this course open for history, namely, to call upon the state and do that which the working class should have done. The state must take in hand the land and the mechanism of production and distribution, and it must determine their use in accordance with a national plan. When a state, in addition to its political function, also assumes the economic function, the state becomes the capitalist, and we have state capitalism. State capitalism may come from below through a bloody revolution, as was the case in Soviet Russia, or it may come from above, as will likely be the case in this country. It is state capitalism just the same. Again, the state may become the absolute owner of the land and the mechanism of production and distribution, as it is in Soviet Russia. Or the state may content itself only with the absolute control of the land and the mechanism of production and distribution. It is state capitalism just the same. For he who absolutely controls the means of life actually owns them, although nominally they belong to private individuals. Again, the power of the state may be concentrated in the hands of one dictator, as in the case in Soviet Russia, or the power of the state is concentrated in the hands of a dictatorial oligarchy, as is likely to be the case in this country. It is state capitalism just the same, for even a dictatorial oligarchy is governed by an absolute dictator. Clothed with unlimited political and economic power, the state becomes supreme and absolute. A supreme and absolute state cannot tolerate any independence of the people. The state will subordinate to its rule all religious, intellectual, political, and social institutions and functions. The state will dictate what to do, how to do, what to think, and what to believe. The only right that will be reserved to the individual will be the right to work for the state upon terms and conditions determined by the state, and the only freedom that the individual will be permitted to enjoy will be the freedom to live and die for the state. State capitalism is, as the name implies, still capitalism, but in state capitalism the state is the capitalist. The state will exploit the working class, the state will employ the capitalists as salaried officials, and all will be the servants of the state. We need not speculate on the nature of state capitalism. We see its nature in Soviet Russia. The essence of a reality is its form. Destroy its form, and the reality itself is destroyed. This is true of organizations and of states. Every state has a form peculiar to its nature. Destroy the form of a state, and the state itself is destroyed. The form of a state is political in its nature, and the form of state capitalism is fascism. Fascism, then, is the political form of state capitalism. Fascism, in its very nature, is a dictatorship. The dictatorship may be in the name of the proletariat, or in the name of the people, or in the name of a constitution. It is a dictatorship just the same. State capitalism is thus inevitable, and it follows that fascism is inevitable. The revolutionary transformation of society that now takes place all over the world is the transformation of society into state capitalism and fascism. This is the world situation that confronts Jews and thirst-off the human race. Since state capitalism and fascism are historically inevitable, we must accept them and readjust ourselves accordingly. 13. Naive Americans believe that what happened in Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy will not happen here. This is an illusion. What happened there is already happening here. We are already waist-deep in state capitalism and fascism.
De te fa idea narratur.
Naive Americans still believe in the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution, but they do not realize that the Constitution has already fundamentally changed its character. President Roosevelt may honestly believe that he is not a dictator, and he may sincerely hate dictatorship. Yet, from day to day, he becomes ever more and more a dictator. And what Roosevelt does with more or less of self-restraint, his successors will do without any self-restraint. State capitalism and fascism are as inevitable in this country as they are in other countries. All that is necessary that in this country state capitalism and fascism shall be completely established is a national emergency or a war. Once such national emergency or war comes, and it will inevitably come in the near future, and in this country we shall have the state capitalism and fascism that we see in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany. The government in this country has already worked out a complete plan for the mobilization of the industries and the working class, and of using them under state control. Once state capitalism and fascism have been established in this country, they will remain established for a long time to come, for state capitalism, as we shall presently see, has a great historic function to perform. Hence, we must no longer entertain the illusion that we can regenerate private capitalism and its institutions, but we must prepare ourselves to live under state capitalism and be ruled by fascism. This implies a change of ideas, a change of philosophy, and a change of the mode of life. But, oh, this is very hard. Hence, we struggle against this inevitable necessity. But can we successfully struggle against a historic necessity? Those that struggle against history are destroyed by history. This is the world situation that faces mankind. 14. Fascism is the political form of state capitalism, and this means the beginning of socialism. For nearly a century, socialists demanded government ownership and control of the land and the means of production and distribution, but the socialists did not realize that this means state capitalism and fascism. And now that they see their ideal realized, they do not recognize it and hate it. But this is neither unusual nor remarkable. Naive persons are usually disappointed in their ideals when they realize themselves. In their naive dreams, the socialists imagined a socialism in which the working class is in power, and naively assuming that the working class, just as they are already prepared to own and control the production and the distribution of the means of life, the working class will perform this function in a rational and democratic manner. How naive all this was! The socialists never understood history, and they never knew the working class. For thousands of years, the working class were kept back in ignore and dependence and slavery. What do the workers know about organizing the production and the distribution of the means of life? Are they able to organize themselves? Countless bears of times workers tried to organize production and distribution, and they invariably failed. After bitter experiences, they preferred to go back to the capitalists to be exploited by them. At last came the Russian Revolution and the great experiment was made. A bloody war followed by the greatest revolution known to history destroyed the old social order and exterminated the capitalists and the land magnates. The terrain was cleared for the working class to establish themselves in power and to organize production and distribution upon a socialist and democratic basis. And yet, what was the result? In spite of the superhuman effort to realize this idea, we have in Soviet Russia nothing else than state capitalism and fascism. In Soviet Russia, the workers are exploited and oppressed as they never were in any capitalist country. This was inevitable, and it will remain inevitable until such time as the working class will grow up and become mature enough to perform this historic function. Then, and no tuntilthen, will the dream of socialism be realized. But until then, only state capitalism and fascism will be possible and therefore inevitable. But state capitalism and fascism are the beginning of socialism. As the socialists and the communists are themselves in the dark on this subject, we must consider this aspect of the matter fundamentally. 15. We will begin with the consideration of the political form of state capitalism. According to Marx and the Marxists, socialism is only a transitory state between the state of capitalism and the state of communism. What will be the political form of the state during this transitory state? Marx gave the answer. Between the capitalist and the communist system of society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. This corresponds to a political transition period, whose state can be nothing else but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin explained the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the reason for its existence as follows. Socialism is only a transitory state of society. When in a proletarian revolution, the capitalist class is overthrown and the proletariat becomes the ruling class, this will not mean that all opposition to socialism has been overcome. To sustain themselves in power, the proletariat will have to suppress the capitalist class and all others who do not accept the socialist order of society. This will be the dictatorship of the proletariat. This dictatorship will exist until all opposition to the socialist order has been completely overcome, and then the dictatorship of the proletariat will wither away. Since Lenin and the Russian Revolution, much has been said and written about the dictatorship of the proletariat, and yet thus far no one perceived the inherent contradiction which makes the dictatorship of the proletariat impossible. Who is the proletariat? The proletariat is the class of proletarians. Who is a proletarian? A proletarian is a worker who owns neither the land nor the means nor the conditions to labor. All the theonsicists naked labor power which he must selto. The capitalist that he may exist. The capitalist buys the labor power of the worker on the conditions, first, that the worker should submit to the mastery of the capitalist. Secondly, that the worker should submit to the exploitation by the capitalist. Hence, during the existence of capitalism, the proletariat is dictated and exploited by the capitalist class. Now, assume that a proletarian revolution took place, and the proletariat became the ruling class. Whereas before there was a dictatorship of the capitalist class over the proletariat, Now we have a dictatorship of the proletariat over the capitalist class. And, whereas before the capitalist class owned and controlled the land and the means of production and distribution, now the proletariat owns and controls them. And now this question arises: when the proletariat has become the ruling class and owns and controls the land and the means of production and distribution, is it still a proletariat? It is clear that the moment the proletariat becomes the ruling class and owns and controls the land and the means of production and distribution, that very moment the proletariat ceases to be a proletariat, there is no longer an proletariat. We have then the following situation. Before the proletarian revolution, the proletariat was dictated by the capitalist class. After the revolution, there is no longer any proletariat to dictate. The dictators now are no longer proletarians, but rulers and owners of the land and the means of production and distribution. Hence, a dictatorship of the proletariat is a contradiction in terms and impossible. It is like a square circle which is impossible. And now the question arises: how could Marx speak of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and how could Lenin and others accept it? The answer is, Marx uttered a historic truth, but neither he nor all other Marxists understood it. What is this historic truth? This is the truth. A dictatorship of the proletariat is impossible, but a dictatorship in the name of the proletariat is possible, and such dictatorship now exists. 16. What sort of a dictatorship is it? This is the dictatorship of state capitalism. State capitalism is still capitalism. It has all the characteristics of capitalism. It rests upon the exploitation and suppression of the working class. The wages system exists, money exists, and the proletariat exists. Whereas before the proletariat was exploited and dictated by the capitalist class, now it is exploited and dictated by the state. Now, in all forms of society in which there were classes and class struggles, and in which one class exploited and dictated another class, the state ruled and dictated in the name of some body or something. In a monarchy, the state ruled in the name of God or in the name of the divine anointed. In a democracy, the state ruled and dictated in the name of the people. And in state capitalism, the state rules and dictates in the name of the proletariat. In state capitalism, the state rules and dictates in the name of the proletariat, because the state derives its main support from the proletariat. In any period, when the state assumes the power over the mechanism of production and distribution, the state must overcome the capitalist and owning classes, and for this purpose the state must appeal to the proletariat for support. The state then favors the proletariat as against the capitalist class, and the proletariat then supports the state against the capitalist class. We see this process going on now in this country. President Roosevelt and his administration move into the direction of state capitalism. To overcome the determined opposition of the capitalists and the magnates of wealth and power, the government in this country favors the working class, and for this reason the working class in this country is behind the government. And so between the upper and the nether millstones, the capitalist class is grounded into dust and powder and is annihilated. Once state capitalism is fully established, the state then rules and dictates in the name of the proletariat. It rules and dictates the proletariat itself in the name of the proletariat. This is what is actually the case in Soviet Russia, and this will be the case in all other countries to the extent that state capitalism becomes established. Hence, a dictatorship of the proletariat is nothing else than a dictatorship over the proletariat as well as over other classes, but in the name of the proletariat. What follows? We saw that the political form of the social order which will intervene between capitalism and communism will be a dictatorship of the proletariat. And we also saw that this intervening social order will be socialism. It follows that state capitalism is nothing else than the beginning of socialism. And when Marx and others believed that this will actually be a dictatorship of the proletariat, they were deceived. But though they were deceived, history was not deceived. And that history was not deceived will become clear from the language which history spoke through Marx himself. 17. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx formulates a program which the proletariat will follow when it becomes the ruling class. Marx tells us, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Let us consider what Marx tells us here. The transition of society from a capitalist order into a communist order cannot be accomplished by one stroke. Even a world proletarian revolution cannot accomplish this. To accomplish this, it will be necessary not only to reconstruct the whole social foundation, but it will also be necessary to construct a new social superstructure, and to change completely the human attitude towards life and society. This transformation will necessarily take a long time. Between the social order resting on private capitalism and the establishment of universal communism, there will necessarily be an intervening social order which Marx called lower communism, but which is generally called socialism. Socialism will necessarily partake of the nature of capitalism, but its aim will be communism. When the proletariat, through a proletarian revolution, comes into power, it will wrest, by degrees, all capital from the capitalist class, and will centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state and will increase the total productive forces of society. All this will be accomplished by degrees and not all at once. Notice carefully this. Marx does not say that the proletariat will use its political supremacy to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the working class or in the hands of society, but in the hands of the state. This is very significant. We are not yet dealing with an organized working class or an organized society, but we are dealing with a state. And may the state be a proletarian state, a capitalist state, a feudal state, or a state of any kind. It is a state. It is an impersonal power that rules over the people or over the working class. Hence, the coming of the proletariat to political power only means the coming into existence of proletarian state. Since, however, as we just saw, the proletariat cannot rule and dictate, it follows that the proletariat, on coming into political power, can bring out only a state, which will rule and dictate the proletariat as well as all other classes. 18. Marx tells us further, abolition of property in land, and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Now, Marx himself showed that rent is nothing else than a part of the profits extorted from the working class through exploitation. We assumed that, through a revolution, the proletariat became the ruling class and the owner of the land and the means of production and distribution. How does rent now come into existence? Rent implies money, and money implies wages, and wages imply exploitation. All this Marx himself taught us. Thus we see that, even after the proletariat has become the ruling class, there will be a proletariat and it will be exploited. And this we actually have in Soviet Russia. Next, Marx tells us, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. What are taxes and what is income tax? Taxes, like rent, are only a part of the profits extorted from the working class by exploitation. And so, again, we have money, wages, and exploitation. Next, who pays income tax? Not the worker, but the exploiter. And so we see that, even after a proletarian revolution, there will exist exploitation and an exploited proletariat. And this is what we have in Soviet Russia. Again, Marx tells us, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Of what kind of inheritance does Marx speak? Suppose a worker dies, will his personal belonging pass over to the state, and not to his children? This is not what Marx contemplates. Marx means those possessions of an individual which are more than of a personal nature. Property which is more than of a personal nature is nothing else than property of a profit-bearing nature. The state may own and control all land and all means of production and distribution, and the state may monopolize all banks, all industries, and all commerce, yet there will be individuals who will own shares in all the state enterprises and economic functions, and which ownership will yield them during their lifetime a share in the state profits. And so, even after a proletarian revolution, there will be rich and poor. And this, again, is what we have in Soviet Russia. Marx tells us further, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. The property of the rebels was always confiscated by the state. But what property of rebels and emigrants is here meant? Not property of a personal nature, but property of a profit-bearing nature. Next to such property, rich individuals will be allowed to own mansions, estates, and the like. And so the same old story will be repeated. The rich will live in mansions, and the poor, unlike the foxes that have holes and the birds that have nests, have nowhere to lay their head. And this, again, is what we see now in Soviet Russia. Further, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of national banks with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. See what we have here: credit, bank, capital, and monopoly. We have here a regular capitalist system. We have here money, wages, exploitation, and an exploited proletariat, and all these after the proletariat has become the ruling class. The capital is monopolized by the state, the national banks belong to the state, the national credit is owned and controlled by the state, and the state has an exclusive monopoly of commerce. All this is owned and controlled by the state, not by the people, not by the working class, and not by society. All this we have now in Soviet Russia. Again, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Again, in the hands of the state and not in the hands of the people, of the working class, or of society. This, too, is what we have now in Soviet Russia. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Again, the state and not the people, the working class, or society. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Think of it, industrial armies. An army is an army, whether it is an industrial army or a military army. An army is subject to military rule and discipline. Have we not such industrial armies in Soviet Russia? Have we not now in Soviet Russia armies of laborers watched over by soldiers with bayonets? Have we not now in Soviet Russia armies of prison labor? Are not roads, canals, and all sorts of Dnieperstroys, and all kinds of stroys performed by prison labor surrounded by soldiers with bayonets? Finally, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. Now, children get free education in all advanced capitalist countries. Child labor in the form that prevailed in Europe in the year 1848, when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, was already abolished in all advanced capitalist countries. Yet Marx contemplates child labor even after the proletariat has come to power. And this, again, we see now in Soviet Russia. 19. What does all this signify? It signifies that Marx contemplated nothing else than state capitalism. He called it lower communism, others called it socialism, but it is nothing else than state capitalism. True enough, Marx and others did not expect state capitalism to turn out to be what we see it to be in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, but this was due to the fact that they overestimated the working class. They thought the working class was prepared for this great historic function, and now we see that it will yet take a long time before the working class will be prepared to take in hand the land and the means of production and distribution and use them rationally and in a democratic manner. But whatever Marx and others expected is of no consequence. Of consequence is what life and history say, and they tell us that the only social order that can take the place of the present social order is a social order resting on state capitalism, having fascism as its political form. Now, state capitalism will necessarily assume in different countries different aspects, just as private capitalism assumed in different countries different aspects, all depending upon economic and historic conditions and the degree of development of the nation. It is certain that state capitalism in this country will not be as crude and brutal as it is in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. And this state capitalism is nothing else than the beginning of socialism. Stalin and Hitler made the wonderful discovery that socialism can be realized in one country, though all other countries may yet be in a state of private capitalism or even feudalism. And so, Stalin tells us that in Soviet Russia they already realized socialism, and now are building for communism. And likewise, Hitler tells us that in Nazi Germany they have realized socialism. In both countries we have national socialism. All right, if the Stalins and the Hitlers prefer to call it socialism, we'll accept their words, and Waton will call it socialism. But a name does not change the character of a thing. Call it socialism if you like, but it is state capitalism. Marx made this perfectly clear. Socialism means nothing less than the abolition of the wages system, the abolition of exploitation, and the abolition of the proletariat. Since, however, in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany we have the wages system, exploitation, and the proletariat, we have in these countries state capitalism, and this state capitalism is the beginning of socialism. Only upon the basis of state capitalism will socialism become possible. Now, naive doctrinaires tell us that the Stalins and the Hitlers perverted the doctrines of Marxism. How naive this is! If anything Marx made perfectly clear, it is this: a social order cannot be charmed into existence by recipes and doctrinaire. Suppose these doctrinaire revolutionaries were in the places of the Stalins and the Hitlers, what social order would they establish? Men that could not hold on to power, when a revolution brought them to power, such men would not be able to accomplish even as much as the Stalins and the Hitlers accomplished. Hence we must pay no attention to what these naive doctrinaires tell us, and we must consider soberly what life and history tell us, and they tell us that only state capitalism can take the place of private capitalism. State capitalism has a great function to perform, and one of its functions is to prepare the world for socialism. This is the reason why state capitalism is the beginning of socialism. Stalin and Hitler are right when they tell us that in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany they have already socialism, but they forget to tell us that they have only the beginning of socialism. With this correction, what they tell us is true, and now we must go a step further and see what historic function state capitalism has yet to perform before socialism will be realized. 20 Marx said, "No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces, for which there is room in it, have been fully developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of old society." Marx utters here a profound truth, and we must endeavor to understand it. By the productive forces, Marx means the working class and the means of production. By the relations of production, Marx means the property relations. If the land and the means of production are owned and controlled by private capitalists, then the working class is necessarily converted into a class of proletarians, who own nothing else than their labor power, which they must sell to the capitalists, and must submit to exploitation and dictatorship by the capitalist class. On the other hand, if the land and the means of production will be owned and controlled by the working class, then there will be the state of socialism, and then there will no longer be exploitation and a proletariat. According to the above statement of Marx, capitalism will not disappear before the working class and the mechanism of productions have been fully developed, and socialism will not appear before the material conditions for its existence have matured in the womb of capitalism. Now, what are the conditions to the existence of socialism? A beginning of socialism may exist in one country, but socialism as a social order can exist only upon an international basis, only when most of the advanced countries have established socialism. Likewise, that socialism may be realized, the working class of the most advanced countries must be ready, able and willing to take in hand the land and the means of production and distribution, and use them in a rational, organized, and democratic manner. This means that, in order that socialism may be realized, most of the earth must be conquered for progress and civilization, and most of the workers in the advanced countries must become rational and capable of producing the means of life in a rational and democratic manner. Now, what are the conditions before us? Thus far, only 1/5 of the earth was conquered for progress and civilization. 4/5 of the earth are still in a backward state. Next, the great mass of workers, even in the most advanced countries, are yet in a state of ignorance and unconsciousness. They are still dehumanized and degraded slaves, and are yet wholly unfit for rational cooperation. And the small fraction of so-called revolutionary workers are split up into thousands of fractions, and are ready to destroy one another. Thus we see that neither the material conditions nor the working class are yet prepared for socialism. It is the historic function of state capitalism to prepare the material conditions and the working class for socialism. And this will take a long time. Hence, state capitalism will exist for a long time. If state capitalism will not be able to perform its historic function, then the present social order will be destroyed, and mankind will revert back to barbarism, and then begin the historic cycle all over again. Now, whatever be the outcome of the revolutionary transformation that now takes place all over the world, this is certain, that we are entering into an era of state capitalism and fascism. In different countries, state capitalism and fascism will assume, more or less, different forms, but essentially they will be the same. Viewing the revolutionary transformation of society that goes on all over the world from the economical and political aspect, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany are the same in essence and historic tendency. Soviet Russia, the child of a complete revolution, is more complete in form than Nazi Germany, which is still in the middle of the revolutionary transformation. 21. Now, the communists and the fascists will emphatically deny this. They will insist that, even economically and politically, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany are absolutely different from each other. Well, let them deny, but we know the truth and the facts. Viewing both countries from the economical and political aspect, what is the difference between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, accepting that the former is more advanced than the latter? Let us consider a few facts. In both countries, there is an absolute dictatorship over the proletariat and the people. Hitler in Germany is deified as much as Stalin is in Russia. In both countries, the individual was completely subordinated to the state. In both countries, all political rights and freedoms of the individual have been abolished. In both countries, the state is supreme economically as well as politically. In both countries, the state determines production and distribution. In both countries, the children are trained and disciplined for the state. In both countries, the children are taught to disregard parents and obey the state. In both countries, the children are taught to spy on the parents and to report to the state. And, when we disregard non-essential differences, in both countries they have the same philosophy. And what is true of these two countries is, in a greater or lesser degree, also true of fascist Italy, and all other countries that fall in line. But, I am asked, if Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany are economically and politically the same, why are they deadly enemies of each other? Why are the Russian communists and the German Nazis deadly enemies of one another and ready to destroy one another? Does this prove that economically and politically Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany are different? That this question is at all asked is proof of the thoughtlessness of those that raise this question. Before, however, I answer this question, I want to put to the communists and the Nazis a few questions, and let them answer these case tie-ins. The Stalinites and the Trotskyites are both communists, Marxists, revolutionaries. Both had the same origin, the same revolutionary struggles, both were identified in the Russian Revolution and the building up of Soviet Russia, and both have the same aim. Why, then, are they deadly enemies of one another? Why are they ready to unite, even with the German Nazis, to destroy one another? Can the communists and the Nazis answer this question? Again, the Catholics and the Protestants are both Christians, both had the same origin, both had the same history and the same traditions, both believe in Jesus and both recognize the New Testament. Why, then, about 400 years ago the Catholics and the Protestants were involved in a life and death struggle and were determined to destroy one another. And even now, though between the Catholics and the Protestants there is an apparent peace and reconciliation, all this is only apparent. In reality, there is latent among them the possibility of another life and death struggle in the near future. Why is this so? Can the communists and the Nazis explain this? Again, the capitalists and the capitalist countries have always been at war with one another, and the recent World War was a war between capitalist countries. Since they were all capitalists and capitalist countries, why were they at war with one another? Whatever be the answer which the communists and the Nazis will give to these questions will also be the answer to the question, why the communists and the Nazis are at war with one another. There are differences between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany which make them deadly enemies of one another, though economically and politically they are the same. Soviet Russia has more land and raw materials than it needs, while Nazi Germany has not enough land and has still less of the raw materials. If the communists were true communists and not fascists parading as communists, then they would share with the German people the great abundance of land and raw materials which they possess in Soviet Russia. In turn, the German people would place their great knowledge, technique, and discipline at the services of the Russian people. And thus, Bothwold benefit and they would be to best off friends. But the communists are only fascists and nationalists. They are like the Nazis, and between fascists there will necessarily be war and struggle about land and raw materials. 22. Men are thinking and speaking beings. Whatever men do is preceded and accompanied by thought and speech. Hegel said, "In a reflecting and reasoning age, a man is not worth much who cannot give a good reason for everything, no matter how bad or how crazy. Everything in the world that has been done wrong has been done for the best of reasons." Between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany a war is impending, unless they come to terms in a peaceful manner. It is therefore natural that either side to the struggle should justify itself in advance by good reasons. The Nazis want to tear off from Soviet Russia the Ukraine, and therefore they must give a reason for this, and here is the reason. The communists are Marxists, Bolshevists, internationalists, Jews, enemies of the Aryans and their culture. Soviet Russia is ruled by Jews and barbarians that are incapable of culture. Are not these good reasons why the German people, the chosen people, the highest cultured people of the highest Aryan race? Are not all these good reasons why the German people are entitled to Ukraine? In turn, the Russian rulers do not want to share their abundance of land and raw materials with the German people. Therefore, they must give a good reason why they should not act communistically. The Nazis are fascists, reactionaries, enemies of the working class. They are the bulwark of capitalism. They are barbarians. Are not these good reasons why the Nazis should not be permitted to share in the bounties enjoyed by the Russian people? But when we examine the matter soberly and closely, we see that they are birds of a feather, though as yet they do not flock together. We need not deceive ourselves by their ideologies and what they say about one another. The communism that exists in Soviet Russia is only fascism, and is like the fascism that exists in Nazi Germany. Both hate democracy, both stand for dictatorship, both are imperialistic, both seek to dominate the whole earth and the whole human race. Both carry on the same propaganda and in the same manner. Soviet Russia is the fatherland for all communists in the world, no matter where they are, and all communists owe primary allegiance to Soviet Russia. Likewise, Nazi Germany is the fatherland for all Nazis in the world, no matter where they are, and they owe primary allegiance to Nazi Germany. In both countries, blood purges take place. In both countries, there are concentration camps and prisons where millions of men and women are tortured for no other sins than suspicions that they do not recognize the divinity of Stalin or Hitler. In both countries, labor is conscripted. In both countries, the real owner and master over the land, production and distribution is the state. In other words, in both countries, we have state capitalism and fascism. This means that economically and politically both countries are the same. Still more, when we look into the matter still deeper, we see that Nazi Germany is only an imitation of Soviet Russia. The Nazis in Germany have adopted the philosophy, the policy and the methods of Soviet Russia. Nazism in Germany is what Bolshevism is in Russia. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution has already accomplished its task, while in Germany the Bolshevik Revolution is still performing its task. But it is urged. Nazi Germany is anti-Semitic, while Soviet Russia is not anti-Semitic. First, we must be clear about this. I speak here of the economico-political aspect of both countries, and in this respect both countries are the same. But Nazism differs from fascism in this, that Nazism, in addition to its being fascism, is also anti-Semitic. Of this I will speak later. We will then see that anti-Semitism is not an essential characteristic of fascism. The proof of this is Italy. Until recently, fascist Italy was not anti-Semitic. It became recently anti-Semitic first because the Jews carried out a world struggle against the fascists, and secondly because Italy became an ally of Nazi Germany. But viewing the world situation in its economico-political aspect, we see that state capitalism and fascism will take the place of private capitalism and democracy all over the world. This is the world situation that faces the Jews.